Welcome to the Girlfriend God Podcast, a podcast in search of and in service to the divine feminine, bringing you an equal mix of academic research and emotional spiritual experience. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment. If you enjoy this podcast, share it with your friends, rate and review it if you're listening on a streaming platform. Follow on social media on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Now, let's get in the flow. Okay. Welcome to the Girlfriend God. Today, I'm happy to welcome Lori Davis to the show. Lori is the host of the podcast Her Half of History. She holds a degree in history, and her graduating thesis was on women and literacy rates in the early territorial period of New Mexico. Spoiler alert, not much improved, right?
Indeed.
She spent her career dabbling through the corporate world, freelance writing, freelance music gigs, and private piano teaching. She says that her podcast is a happy return to the intersection of women, history, and words. And today we're going to be talking about, and I am going to not pronounce this correctly, Rosa Maria. You know what? I'm not even going to try.
Is how I'm
not even
going
to try.
I'm not claiming to be fluent in Portuguese, but I did talk to someone who is fluent in Portuguese, and he said Egipcíaca, and I apologize right away if my accent's bad.
Say it again.
Egipcíaca.
Okay, that.
Yes.
Da Vera Cruz.
Yes.
Okay, so Lori, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So we decided to talk about this particular character in the history because, usually on this podcast, I mean, we've talked about all kinds of things, but what I haven't done is talk about like real women in history as opposed to, mythology goddesses or how we use goddesses in those of us that walk a goddess path in our spiritual lives. But I do want to start recording some episodes about these real women in history who have had a spiritual influence to some degree. And this woman's story, when I read about it, I was like, my God, like, you know what
incredible.
I mean? It's an amazing story. So I titled the episode From Slave to Judger of Souls.
Yes.
So I'm just going to let you tell the story, and I'm going to interrupt you and ask questions. All right?
Okay, that sounds good.
So where does the story begin, and when does the story begin?
Right. So the story begins in West Africa. I have read both Nigeria and Benin. We don't really have like a birth certificate for her or anything like that,
Right.
But probably about the year 1719, she was born there. We find out about her, though, not from a birth, but by knowing she was about 6 years old when she was put on a slave ship and did the Middle Passage with all the horrors that you learned about in school with that over to Brazil.
So we know that would have been about 7. So we know that because there are records of the slave ship manifest.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Also because of her testimony. She was completely lost in history until, I guess this is your spoiler alert right here. By the end of her life, she's being questioned by the Inquisition in Lisbon, Portugal. So we also have what she said her life story was in their records in there. So, and when you give evidence under those circumstances, of course, you might not remember everything strictly accurately, but this is our best understanding that she would have been born about 1719. She would have arrived in Rio de Janeiro about 1725 at about 6 years old. So, of course, it's not a good situation right there. We have her first owner. His name was Acevedo. And the only thing I really know about him is that he abused her in every possible way that you can imagine.
And she's
At the age
not.
of, oh, she was 6 when it
Oh,
started.
6.
Yeah, 6 when she arrived. Yeah, definitely a child. I don't have any details on, the abuse and when it started or any of that. It's just not recorded as far as I can tell. Many of the records are in 18th century Portuguese, which is not my strong point.
Right.
So based on what I can tell, there's no details about that, but you can imagine, right? At age 14, she is sold to go to Minas Gerais, which is like a frontier mining town. And one of the things that is interesting when you study the history of slavery is I feel like many Americans have this visual image of what slavery meant, and it's mostly based off of having watched Gone with the Wind.
Right.
But actually, slavery is a very diverse institution. It didn't look the same for everyone. It's hard even to say anything coherent about slaves as a whole because the situation is just very different depending on who you are and where you are. So she was not, she wasn't living on a plantation where she was, worked really hard, but then given food. And she was responsible for her own food and shelter. And then her owner would just show up periodically and expect to be paid. So basically, she had to support herself and have enough money left over to pay her owner what he felt like he owned. Now, of course, does she have any skills or capital? No, of course she doesn't. So prostitution is really her only option. And that's what
Okay.
she was there for, was to be a prostitute for the large group of miners that work in Minas Gerais. And she wouldn't have been alone. There were others as well. So in a sense, that means she had more personal freedom than we may sometimes assume, like over day-to-day decisions. But it's nonetheless a terrible situation, right?
So would she have lived with other women that were doing the same thing,
Whatever she could work out. So
or
she
other
may have
girls?
at sometimes she may have been on the streets at sometimes. But she
But this was
wasn't
a
being,
but it was a prevalent situation. Like there were
yeah,
many other
right.
girls
She
that
was
were
not
doing the same
alone.
thing.
For sure.
Okay.
She was not alone in this. This was just one way to handle slavery is not to hold them in your own house and work them, but just expect them to provide you with money,
Right.
however they could get it. Right. So she is there for 15 years doing that. And then in 1748, so she's almost 30, she falls ill and her face swelled and she had a tumor in her stomach and she had fainting fits. And in these fainting fits, she began to see visions. And we are hearing most of her visions from much later when she's in Lisbon, and it's a little unclear how much she may have modified them based
Mhm.
on her audience at this point. But she is definitely seeing visions that were very impressive to the local people, including the Catholic priests. So, for example, she would say that she had seen the Virgin Mary in the heavens and she had heard choirs of angels. She had learned prayers from them. She also learned about, through revelation, about the location of a spring of water. And then when they went to that place, they did find a spring of water and there was a church built there. So her fame starts to grow and among a diverse group of people. So obviously, there are other Black slaves like herself who are very impressed, but also the white Catholic clergy were also impressed by her.
So the
And
church that was built where the spring was,
mhm,
is where we are now, predominantly Catholic.
yes,
Was
yeah,
the
certainly
church was the
Catholicism.
church a Catholic church?
Yes, yes, it was a Catholic church for sure. Yeah. Um, there was a particular priest, his name was Lopez, and he was famous for driving out devils, for doing exorcisms. He even had a nickname that I am not going to attempt to pronounce, but it means one who drives out devils. Okay.
Okay.
And he also drove out 7 devils from Rosa. He felt that she was possessed in a special way, though, that when she was disturbed, she gave edifying sermons. And he actually arranged for her to be freed. He got a nephew of his the details are again a little bit fuzzy, but if I understand it right, he got a nephew of his to purchase another slave and then traded her owner for her. Not to hold her as a slave himself, but she's manumitted. She's free after, how many years? 25 years of slavery.
And now she's 30.
Yes.
She's still 30. Okay.
Yeah, she's about approximately 30. Right. So, being free, she decides that she's going to give up her life of prostitution. She sold what possessions she had and gave the money to the poor. And I can't help like reading that sentence, which it says, without thinking she was one of the poor. I mean, how many possessions could she possibly have had? But
Right.
whatever it was that she had, she gave it to the poor to devote herself to the church and a spiritual life.
So what were her, when she was sick, like legit sick,
Yes.
is there a record of what was wrong with her?
Well, I mean, we have a record of symptoms that she said, like her face swelled up and she had pains in her stomach and fainting fits. We can really only, when we look in the historical record at symptoms, you can only sort of guess at what they are. One very obvious guess is she had some sort of venereal disease. I mean,
Right.
there's plenty of opportunity for that.
Right.
Also, it's not a super healthy environment either.
Right.
So I don't have an exact diagnosis. No.
Right. Well, and thinking about what you were saying about being poor in the possessions, but I mean, if she was doing it for 15 years, maybe she figured out how to make that work for her.
Maybe.
And did have some money and some possessions, and you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I can hope so. I can hope that something was working for her. It's just such a depressing situation to think that anybody would ever be in, and yet there were millions like her, throughout history.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so she is gathering a following in Minas Gerais, and what really becomes interesting, I think, probably from your point of view, is something that I didn't initially pick up on it at all, but I had to, read some other sources about it, which is that while she was definitely trying to appeal to the Catholic clergy and the Catholic spiritual practice, she certainly took communion, she went to church, all of that. Some of her imagery and the way that she behaved may actually have been more African. And originally I thought, well, she was only 6 when she left Africa. How much can she possibly have known about religious practice there?
Right.
But she's coming to a place that's surrounded by other people who were from there, many of whom were older.
Right.
So there are some ideas in the way that she behaves that can be interpreted through Yoruba religious practices like spirit possession and what they call mounting. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this religious practice, but where the spirit comes, and it's called mounting, as I understand it, because it's like mounting a horse, that the spirit would come and take possession of you. And then that may have been appealing to the community that she was speaking to, because it could be interpreted either as Catholicism or in this other religious tradition. In terms of attending church, though, as I'm sure you know, really for all women in trying to take a religious position, you really run the risk of, are you a saint possessed by God, or are you inspired by the devil? And are you a witch and a heretic? Like the line between those two things is very, very thin.
Right.
So she got into trouble with the way that she would behave in church, not because she wasn't trying to support the church. She was trying to support the church. But for example, she would, if people were talking during communion, she would stand up in church and yell at them for their disrespect. Or in one case, she actually physically threw someone out of the church for their disrespectful behavior. And that, was maybe not exactly what the Catholic priests were going for, but it was at least in support of them. Where she really got in trouble, though, was when they had a visiting priest come and speak, and she stood up and yelled that he was from Satan during the service. You can imagine they didn't take that all that kindly.
Oh.
Right. So in that case, she is arrested and taken to the headquarters of the bishopric while
But
they
arrested
try
for
to
what? I mean, what is the charge?
that I don't have a specific charge, but I'm also not sure that they really needed a specific charge. There's no separation of church and state here. So
Right.
did they
Well,
need a charge?
that
They
hasn't
might not
really
have.
changed either, even though we like to think
Well,
so.
more so than here.
Right.
I
Right.
don't think you can be arrested for yelling in church at this point. You know, you could be asked to leave for sure. Anyway, they, for one thing, they flog her, and she is partially paralyzed for the rest of her life. They flog
Right.
her that badly. But they also assemble a group of theologians because they need to decide whether she is a fraud, maybe she's making it all up, or is she a saint? You know, she's being inspired by God, or is she a witch and she's being inspired by the devil? And so they gather a group of undoubtedly all men theologians to decide what she is. And of course, this being the 18th century, it involves a series of trials. And the one that gets mentioned the most is that I really don't even understand the logistics of this, but they hold a lighted candle under her tongue to see if she can withstand or if she'll recant. Anyway, apparently she endures that for 5 minutes without recanting. Their decision after this is that she's a fraud. That's their decision. They're not saying that she's worshiping the devil. They're saying that she's making it up. Anyway, she and Lopez, the priest who arranged for her to be manumitted, they run away. They flee. They get out of there, which is probably the best move. And they move from Minas Gerais to Rio de Janeiro. That's where she originally landed in the first place. So this was a natural place to go.
Right.
In Rio, she manages to hook up with the Franciscan convent of San Antonio, which, by the way, is still there. It's still a convent in the same place. And they either didn't know or they didn't care what the panel had decided in Minas Gerais because they're very impressed with her, the monks there. And she, again, is following many practices that were very familiar to them: fasting, also self-flagellation, which is common in the Catholic practice at the time. There's also a more cynical view. And again, here you get in, even as a historian, we struggle to decide what were people's motives, right? So right. The charitable interpretation is that the monks were genuinely deeply impressed with her spiritual experiences and knowledge and all of that. The less charitable view is that they were looking for a Black example to help them convince the large Black community. They needed someone who could speak to them. So was it pure manipulation? I don't know. I think it's likely that it was a mix. You know, they could see the benefits of bringing her on board, but they may also have been very impressed by her.
Right.
Right. So here is where she changes her name. And unfortunately, I have no idea what her original African name was. I'm certain it wasn't Rosa. I think it probably was Rosa as a slave, but the Maria Egipcíaca part comes in here. She changes her name, which is a long tradition in spiritual practice, that when you reach a certain point, you get a new name.
Right.
And the name that she chose was after Mary of Egypt. That's what Egipcíaca means in Portuguese. It's Mary of Egypt, who was a saint in the Catholic Church from centuries earlier in Egypt. And the story of this Mary is very parallel to Rosa's own story. She was a prostitute who then in Jerusalem saw the error of her ways, was penitent, and was later canonized, and she is the patron saint of penitence. So this whole story of adopting that name for herself is to emphasize what her history was, is that it was
Right.
not a history of perfection. She was no Virgin Mary, but she was Mary of Egypt, who spent many years being the depths of society and morality, if you wanted to look at it that way, and then became pure and cleansed through her relationship with Christ. So it's a very Catholic thing to do. The other thing that she did here that's really just amazing for the time period is the monks taught her how to read and write. And you have to understand that this is a mostly illiterate society. It's not just because she was a slave that she didn't know how to read and write. If she'd been free, she probably also would not have known how to read and write.
Right.
But she is taught to read and write, and she starts writing letters to various people. She's also the first Black woman in Brazil to write a book. She wrote a 250-page manuscript about her visions and her experience.
But some of it is lost, right?
Oh, yeah. In fact, most of it is lost. There are a few pages of it that survived, but most of it is gone, which is a real tragedy that we don't get to see it.
And kind of a mystery too, right?
Well,
I think that's what I
yes,
read, is that
we
because
don't know exactly what happened to it, but it's very possible that she or someone on her side destroyed it on purpose, because it probably would not have helped her with the Inquisition. It
okay.
was evidence of things that they might not have liked, and
Right.
we'll get into that. So one of her letters that she wrote, she says in the letter, she's writing, well, okay, she says in the letter that while praying and doing so before a statue of the Virgin Mary, she had the overwhelming compulsion to write to a certain priest and ask him to make a donation in order to build a refuge for women. And so she does. She writes the priest that letter. He makes a donation, and she is able to build a home that is basically a women's shelter, is what it is. And it was for mixed race, it was for mixed backgrounds, mixed social statuses. Many of them were women who had a history similar to her own. It was a place to retreat. Some of them were actually daughters of her former owners. So it's a very mixed area. That was founded in 1754, and they didn't take vows, so they're not nuns,
Right.
but they did live sort of that nun lifestyle. They're there to pray and to meditate, and they are living off donations of people who come to visit.
Like
These people,
that in and of itself is incredible.
yeah, it is. I mean, you think about where she came from, even if the rest of it were not there, the fact that she was once living on the streets as a prostitute, and now she's founding a women's shelter and able to convince people to pay for it. That right
And
there, it's a miracle.
this is still in the 1700s that this
Yeah.
is happening.
Yes.
That's remarkable.
Yes, it absolutely is.
Right. I'm blown away by all of that,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The people here, they call her Mother Rosa, or they sometimes call her Santa Rosa. Now, she's never a saint in the formal sense of being canonized by the Catholic Church,
Right.
But she was a saint to them. By popular acclaim, she was a saint. So she is again gathering a following in this new place, and it's getting more and more extreme than what she had in Minas Gerais. It's getting bigger, honestly. People would basically take a pilgrimage to come and ask her for her advice on certain subjects. They also ate her relics, and this is something that's a little bit it's sketchy when you know about modern hygiene, but the relic that they ate was a biscuit that was made of flour and her saliva.
Yeah, I read about that.
Yeah, not a fan myself, but it just kind of shows you the way that they viewed her. They viewed
Yeah.
her as a saint. That's
I
what a
mean,
relic is for,
that's real
right?
devotion.
It absolutely is. And she continued to have her visions and to write them. And they are still very based in the Catholic tradition, but they're starting to get further and further away from what you think the Catholic theologians probably wanted. So, for example,
So,
she says,
yeah, that's what I was going to say. Such as,
yeah, she says that the baby Jesus came every day to nurse from her and to comb her hair. Now, that may not have been too far out for the Catholics, but she then starts to say things that like she had died and risen from the dead. She starts to say that she had received from God the title of Mother of Justice and that she would decide the future of souls going to heaven or hell. She said that she was the spouse of the Holy Trinity and that she was the new Redeemer of the world. So you can imagine a lot of Catholics would not be super pleased
right.
with the direction that this is going. But there's also some imagery that, again, I would not have picked up on, but shows that she was maybe still drawing from the African tradition as well. So, for example, in one of her visions, she sees a great white tree, and at the top, she sees the Virgin Mary and six Sacred Hearts. So that still sounds very Catholic, right? But the imagery of the tree and the coloration of the tree is apparently from one of the versions of the creation myth in Yoruba.
Oh, okay.
In the Yoruba religion, the white and green leaves, and there's an idea that the tree is the throne of God. And so again, this may well have been her drawing in from a totally different religious tradition. Lopez, the priest, was still with her, and he had copper images made of her where she's posing as a saint, and she does look, she's wearing a Franciscan habit. So again, she looks like she's firmly within the Catholic tradition, except that she's not actually a Franciscan, right? She's a woman. And she's also stepping on devils and raising a soul from purgatory. So she is kind of elevating herself to a level that they were not expecting really any woman to be in
Right.
at any point. But again, it's interesting to me that what really gets her in trouble is not so much the things that she was saying, but the way that she was interacting with powerful people. So, for example, the particular issue that got her into trouble with the Inquisition is that there was a highborn lady who attended the church, and apparently Rosa did not believe, she did not approve of her behavior during Mass, and she threw her out of the church publicly. And this is a highborn woman, so that's, again, not going to go over well. So she is arrested and witnesses are called, and all of these revelations that she's had that people in the area knew about, but maybe the church hierarchy was either looking the other way or, maybe the very highest didn't know about it. All of these come out in the proceedings of the trial. And that is why in 1763 they decide to send her to Lisbon to face the Inquisition. Now, this again I find very strange because ordinarily you wouldn't think that the local hierarchy would have any trouble dealing with a Black woman ex-slave. You wouldn't think that they would need Lisbon's help in dealing with this, which I think just must show the level of support that she had, because otherwise they wouldn't have needed
Right.
any more authority than they already had.
Right.
But they apparently decide that they don't have the authority to make a decision in this case, and they send her to Lisbon. Also with Lopez. He's still with her, and he also goes.
What is he doing this whole time?
Well, he was also a priest, and he was there. He also moved in with the Franciscans. So as far as I can tell, really what he's doing is he's promoting her. He's promoting her vision. He's explaining
He's like her manager.
Yeah, well, he's being the authority figure that supports her, right? Because he is an ordained priest in Catholicism. That means this is all legit, right?
So are we assuming that he's her lover?
I do not know that. I didn't read anything that said that, but I wouldn't expect to. I don't think that would be in the record.
Do you think
If
that?
anything, it would be in there as an accusation, but it wouldn't necessarily be confirmed.
Do you think that?
Do I think that? That's an interesting question. I will say that I personally think she believed, and you'll see why, though, you know, it could be argued. I think she believed, and I think her view of herself as Mary of Egypt, as the person who renounced that lifestyle in favor of what was supposed to be a higher way, which would have been chastity. I suspect my personal take on it would be that she believed that and was living that by this point.
Okay.
But is that provable? No, it's not provable. It could go in many different directions.
Okay. I think maybe they were lovers in the beginning.
Maybe. Yeah, that could be as well. It could be that it
I
changed.
just think he's still a man,
Yes.
you know?
And you're about to see him be a man in the Inquisition.
Oh, okay.
So,
Uh,
1763, she is sent to Lisbon. And the trials there, it's not like they were in trial every single day. Basically, they're held and occasionally they're brought before the panel of judges to answer questions. Okay. So, after just a few sessions and no details on what sessions means, does it just means you were asked questions or is it considerably more physical than that? I don't know, but certainly the threat of it being more physical than that was there, even if it actually wasn't there.
right.
So after just a few sessions, Lopez completely backslides. Okay. So he claims that he was deceived. He claims that he believed in her, but he wasn't well trained in theology, that the Franciscans had thought well of her. So he had too. So basically, he was naive, but not malicious. Okay. What it doesn't say there is actually he was her supporter long before she got to the Franciscans. So you can't really blame the Franciscans for that. But basically he recants. And given the situation, who can blame him really? It
Right.
would have been a terrible situation. So he is stripped of his priestly office and banished for 5 years. And that's his punishment. He exits the story here. But Rosa did not recant in any way. She believed it was all real. She continued to insist on it. Her exact words, in translation, of course, were "I saw and heard it all." So she never changes her mind, and that's why I think she was really a true believer in it. Because it would have been so easy for her to say, "Oh yeah, I made it all up," but she didn't. She didn't choose that. So her final session before the Inquisition judges was on June 4th, 1765. And the record is incomplete. Like there's no record of a verdict. It just this is the final session and then there's nothing else. There
That's
is
weird.
how
That's
Yeah,
weird, right?
there is, however, a year or two later, a simple record that she died and that she was found dead in the kitchen, which suggests that it's not like she's in chains in the dungeon, right? She's probably being asked to work. She's probably working in the kitchen and she just got to the end of her time. And, she was fairly old for the time period then, especially after having had the kind of life that she'd had, that she died in the kitchen. So it's unclear, was she still not judged? And so she was just hanging out, because she couldn't leave? Or was she found guilty and her punishment was to be a slave for them? Maybe.
Right.
Or was she found innocent, but she had nowhere else to go at that point? It's not like she had the funds to take a boat back to Rio. So anyway, the end of the story is just a little bit unclear as to exactly what they decided about her. Just that she eventually dies and they locked up her records and they stayed in their archives basically untouched until 1983, when a Brazilian anthropologist was digging through their records and found her story and brought it back to light.
Okay. So What did you come across this story? Like, what was it about her that I'm trying to remember what I read about her, like what it was that she was preaching? Because what I read, it seemed like, I mean, it was almost a cult
Yeah,
that
you
these
could view it
people
that
that
way, for sure.
were following her and her
Yes.
prophecies, because by then she was kind of prophesizing,
Yes.
and her prophecies were kind of, I mean, they started to get a little
A little
out there,
strange. Yes,
right?
they did.
Let me see if I can find I think I bookmarked the article that I was looking at. So what led you to her? I'm just
Well,
curious.
on my podcast, I do things thematically for a series, and the series that I was working on was women who escaped from slavery. And I
Okay.
had come into it knowing a number of African American, US slavery to talk about, but I always like to get a cross section of global and throughout time periods. And I initially started thinking that the reason I only knew Americans was because I am American and I was educated here, and I just needed to dig a little to find the women who are not from the United States.
Right.
What I eventually found is actually it's very difficult to find women who escaped slavery who are not from the United States, because almost never were their stories written down. It was really a unique experience in the United States that anyone cared enough to help them write their stories and publish them.
Right.
So I was getting desperate looking for any women who were not American to put in here. And Rosa is the one that I came across for an example of Brazilian slavery. So that's how I got to it. It wasn't through the religious aspect at all that drew me
Right.
to it,
Right.
though I find the religious aspect very interesting.
Sorry, I'm online.
That's okay.
Oh, that's in a page that's not in English. That was not the website that I was on.
Most of the sources are in Portuguese. There's a
Yeah.
700-page biography of her. How they managed to get that much material on her, I have no idea, but it is only in Portuguese, so that didn't help me.
Well, sometimes Google will translate the page for you. It's a
Yes.
useful tool.
Yes.
There's a website called enslaved.org.
Okay.
Have you seen that?
I don't recall I may have run across it when I was doing her series.
Yeah, you should check that out. So what other well, let me ask you this. What other women who became spiritual leaders have you looked at or are you looking at for future episodes? Or can that be a theme?
It would be a theme in and of itself, not one that I've done yet. A couple of women do immediately come to mind, and one is Anne Hutchinson, who founded Rhode Island because she was a Puritan leader, but fell out with the other Puritan leaders, so she led a group away from them. So she comes to mind. Um, Another that comes to mind is St. Clair, who was kind of the female female equivalent to Francis of Assisi. So she founded the Poor Clares, and it became you know, a, an order within the Catholic Church. I mean, those are the two that immediately come to mind. But yes, this is a potential theme for a future series on my
Okay.
show. And I would have to
Okay.
do more digging to find more who are not from that cultural background, but are from
Right.
other parts of
Right.
the world and other time periods.
Yeah, I would love it if you did that. I
Okay.
would.
I
I
will
would
put
love
it
it.
on the list of, I mean, it already is on the list of possibilities.
Because it's so rare, right? Like that's something that I talk about on the show. That part of the problem with a male dominated patriarchal religion is that there are so few religions where women have a place in the hierarchy. I mean, it's not as bad today.
Yes.
There are a lot of religions now where women can become pastors and ministers and
Right.
deaconess
yes,
and all of those things, but there's still a lot of religions that don't allow that.
right. And it's definitely in the history that way. I mean, if you look at it from another, from an unrelated perspective, there are very few women political leaders as well, but there actually was a specific path for them in monarchical societies, and that's when she has no brothers. She might inherit the kingdom because she has no brothers, and that happens, so it's not frequent, but it does happen. Whereas I think in the religious space, there was no clear path, not even an unusual path for a woman to become the spiritual leader.
Right.
And if she does, just like Rosa, she's very likely to be accused of heresy and punished for that.
Well, that's how it is now. It wasn't always that way.
Right. Yes. If you go to the more pagan religions, I'm aware that it was not necessarily that way.
Right. As I said on the show many times, the patriarchy can really only claim about the last 6,000 years.
I agree.
But we have
Yes.
archaeological and anthropological evidence that goddess worship goes back 30,000 years.
Yes.
So,
and that is absolutely accurate.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, Lori, at the end of every show, I ask all the guests the same 3 questions.
Yes, I listened to several of your episodes, and I was so glad that I did, because otherwise these 3 questions would have really flummoxed me, but I'm prepared. Go ahead and ask.
Okay, you're prepared, right? That's what, I ask people to listen to the show, and sometimes they don't, and they are flummoxed by these questions.
Right.
So, okay.
They should listen.
Question number 1, tell me something about yourself that people that know you would be surprised to learn.
I love planning vacations. I plan vacations that I do not have the time or money to take. So I've got lots of planned vacations for the future when I do have more time and money to take them. It's just something I do for fun. I look at, it would be fun to go there.
So you just like the planning, like you
I do. I like the dreaming that, I could go see this really interesting place.
So you plan the itinerary and you look at the plane tickets and where you would stay.
And maybe don't go so far as to look at the plane ticket prices, because that just gets depressing. But I do look at, where would we go? Where would we go? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Fun. That is fun. It's a fun hobby.
It is fun. Yeah.
It's a fun dreaming hobby. Daydreaming is good. I find that to be a useful spiritual tool to daydream.
I agree.
Okay. Current favorite TV series. I was saying current favorite TV series or movies, but everybody's watching TV these days. So I'm just going to start asking favorite TV series. What are you binging now?
Okay. I am currently binging Madam Secretary on Netflix.
Really?
And I'm really enjoying it. Well, it's female dominated. It's about a woman Secretary of State.
Yeah.
And how she handles it. And it's got the global feel that I like, interacting with different cultures. So yeah, it's fun. It's good.
I really like her and her Téa Leoni. That's that actress's name. And a very long time ago, I used to watch, what was the name of the show? It was one of those what was the name of the quiz show where you could, one of your options is you had a lifeline that you could call. What was the name of that quiz show? You remember what I'm talking about, right?
I know what you're talking about, but I will not pull the name out of my head, I'm sure.
Well, whatever it was, they would do every once in a while, they would do a celebrity one. And they had David Duchovny on. And at the time, David Duchovny was married to Téa Leoni.
Okay.
And whatever the question was, he used his lifeline and he called his wife. And I don't remember what the question was, but he was stumped and he called Téa Leoni, and clearly she didn't know the answer either. And I just remember her saying on the phone, "You're screwed, honey." I don't know why I remember that particular thing about her, but I really like her. I've always liked her. Anyway, that's my Téa Leoni story. Plus, and she's beautiful. She's beautiful.
She is.
Okay. If your life were a movie, what would the theme song be on the soundtrack of your life?
Okay, I have to tell you, this one flummoxed me the most. And so I asked my husband, what would the theme song be? So I'm going to tell you his answer, which was great. So I do a lot of classical music, honestly, and he knows that. So he chose the Bach Brandenburg concertos. It's very historical because it's several centuries old, but because it's structured and ordered, but it has beautiful ornamentation. He added the beautiful part at the end, which was very nice of him to tack that on there. But that is what he chose, and I was grateful because I was really struggling with that question.
Okay. All very satisfactory answers.
Okay, well, I'm really glad that I listened and knew they were coming.
And we have another classical piece in the playlist. So that will get
Okay.
added when season 3 is over. I have created a public playlist that's on Spotify and
that's very interesting.
iTunes.
Okay.
And it's the playlist of all the guests' answers to this questions.
Okay,
So I
well,
have
that's a
all of
very
season 1
interesting
and
idea.
season 2 up. I'm actually, when I'm done with you here, I'm about to make a post for that for Instagram and TikTok and Facebook with a link to that playlist for all the songs from season 1 and season 2.
Great. I'll have to check it out.
It's a very eclectic mix,
sure.
as you can imagine.
I'm sure it is. Yeah.
And I've learned a lot about people by asking these questions.
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, I'm going to do the thing that Zoom does and click the end button and disappear.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
But
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for coming on the show and taking the time to talk to me this morning. And I will be in touch when the video is ready.
Great. Great.
But until then, may the peace and the love of the goddess be with you.
And with you.
Okay. I will talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching The Girlfriend God on YouTube. If you enjoy this podcast, the best way you can support it is to like it, follow it, leave comments on the page, rate it, review it, share it with your friends. But most of all, subscribe to this channel. And if you want more of The Girlfriend God, you can find The Girlfriend God on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Thanks again for watching.